welcome to another episode of That VidBlaster Guy. I'm Tom Sinclair, That VidBlaster Guy. Glad to be on the air today. Had some technical difficulties getting started. We'll talk about those in just a minute because we can always learn from that kind of stuff. And wanted to let you guys know today's show is not going to be up to its normal mediocre quality. Will be even lower than that. I got news that a family member died this morning, and so a lot of my pre-show prep time was sort of taken up with talking to family members and trying to figure out just what we're going to do. Is my favorite uncle lived in Charlottesville, Virginia, and was the one that gave me my first car when I was in college, and it's always been an inspiration to me. And even though as he got older, he tended to become somewhat of a recluse, he was always my favorite. And so a hat tip goes out to Vin Miner today. I'll miss him an awful lot. Anyway, That VidBlaster Guy, as you may know if you've watched us before or if this is the first time tuning in, the concept is that one guy with one PC can do one pretty darn good broadcast. And our shows sort of circle around the theme, or three different themes mostly, of talk show broadcasting, sports broadcasting, and today's subject, church broadcasting. Now, they all have a lot of similar elements. I mean, you have cameras, you have microphones, you have PCs, and all the things that go along with that. But there can be some pretty significant differences, and I wanted to take some time and explore those with you today. We've only done one show of the 14 shows that we've done. We've only done one show on church broadcasting, and in YouTube, it is the show that has had the most views. So I thought, well, we better get another show out there on church broadcasting and maybe unpack it a little bit. If you haven't, you want to go back to show 2 and watch Alan Bunt. He was on the show and had some great input for us as he talked about what they were doing at Good Shepherd Lutheran Church. And you can actually catch all that in the archive, and it'll link you to the YouTube if you don't want to go straight to YouTube. Alan uses an interesting setup, and it includes a couple of cameras that are remote controlled, and they're $1,000, $800 cameras each. And I don't think most folks are going to be in that budget. So when we talk about cameras, we're going to be talking, in fact, the whole show today is really going to be not geared at the high-end church that has a huge budget and can do a big TV broadcast, because they're not interested in what we're doing anyway. They're way above us. We're talking about the folks that want to put their own church on the air, either the sermon or a special service or a special presentation or something like that, so that folks at home can watch. Now, who's going to watch these shows? Well, they're probably going to be watched mostly by current church members. Most church members that can't get to church would like to get to church. Some are traveling, some are ill, and they're home. And so it's a great way to stay in touch with what's going on in your church. There's another group, and this is true in my church, Grace Church Anglican, in Fairhope, Alabama, is that there are folks that are sort of friends of Grace Church. That is, if they visit, this is where they come to church. And they may or may not have a home church somewhere else, but they feel like Grace Church is a big part of their life because for whatever reasons, personal reasons. Doesn't have anything to do with what we're talking about today. And so for those folks, it can become a pretty significant thing to be able to peek in on Sunday mornings or Sunday evenings or Wednesday evenings, whenever it would be that you would broadcast, to peek in on their church home away from home. And so I think that's a second good reason. Third good reason is, and this happened to me this past week. My pastor came up to me and said that he was really excited. He was talking to somebody that was in a Caribbean country. I don't remember which country exactly. I'm not going to call it because I'll probably get it wrong. And that country was a small Anglican congregation, maybe a couple of dozen. Certainly not enough to support a full-time pastor or even a part-time pastor for that point. But they wanted to have the ability to get to get the Word taught and preached on a weekly basis? And would we stream our services to them so that they could take advantage of our pastor and his great teaching and preaching abilities? And of course, our pastor was thrilled about this. I mean, what pastor wouldn't be to have somebody come to them and say, please, 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 can we put you on TV so we can watch? And we'd done this before, so I'm not speaking of something that is foreign to me. We did it for several months and for different reasons didn't follow through on it. But that's 3 good reasons right there to consider putting your church or your place of worship live and recorded out on the internet for everybody to see. I do know that a lot of our congregation is aging, and there's some folks that probably haven't been to church maybe 6 months or a year, just because physically they're not able. But what a great ministry to be able to go and hook them up to a PC and or just a laptop with the speakers built in, where they can watch and feel like they are a little bit of a part of things. So I'm trying to make my case there for why you should do it, and that's the case for doing it. And I think VidBlaster is really the ideal video production software, live video production software to make this happen. It's the one I know the best, so of course I'm going to think it's right. It can happen on a laptop. It can happen on a desktop. If we're talking about well, let's go through what a minimal setup would be, and let's start with what's in the house. The church probably will have some sort of audio system, and depending on what that is, will sort of depend on how you can grab a feed from that. Some mixing boards have outs that you can use, either a control room out and get them to route it that way, or a secondary main mix or something like that, where you can get the audio out. Let's see, is it just me? The audio not as good as earlier shows. We're clipping. Thank you, John. Thank you, Jan. We're going to turn that down. Been trying to get a little bit more volume, because I know volume has been an issue, and still working on the audio here. And for those of you watching in YouTube, I just got a message here on the chat room telling me that the audio was clipping a little bit, so we've turned it down a tad, and we'll see if we can't recover just a little bit of that. And let's see if that's any better. Yeah, what I did is turn the gain down, and I'm turning the volume control up. We'll see if that helps any. And trying not to have a lavalier mic or a mic in front of me, trying to do it as if it's just you and me here talking, and I've got a mic that's right above me here. You can pull it down to barely see. It's just out of the frame, and it's a shotgun mic that's pretty much for this purpose. We're trying to adapt it since we already had it on hand, and that's the thing with all of this, is that so much of the equipment that's needed. Thank you, Martin, for the comment. You can sort out the YouTube version of pre-made elements, so a little low at this stage is better than being too high and too clipped. Good point. Good point. Thank you. And Martin was the one that made the recommendation for Adobe Premiere Elements. We'll talk more about that in another show probably. But back to church broadcasting. Grabbing the audio, and as you can tell, audio is really important. Grabbing the audio from the house audio system is not as easy as taking a feed from their system into your PC, because you lose a lot of control when you do that. You end up getting everything they're sending, whether you want it or not. I know in our church situation, we don't stream the entire service. The pastor is concerned that certain parts of the service are more personal and private for the folks that are attending live, and therefore he doesn't think it's appropriate, at least without kind of a group 100% consensus, to be able to move forward on that. And since we don't have that, we haven't done it. What we've done is we've focused the streaming portion of the church services to the Word. So that's the basically in our denomination, it starts out with reading of Scripture from the Bible, sometimes an Old Testament lesson, sometimes a New Testament lesson, and then, excuse me, and that's generally done by a layman, and then that's followed up by the pastor, who will come in and preach a sermon. Sermon might last 20, 25 minutes, 30 sometimes if he gets really fired up. And so the audio prior to the reading of the Word and the audio after the preaching of the Word is probably not audio that needs to be streamed. And so it would be much better. Hang on a second, I'm going to duck out of the scene here for just a minute. I hadn't planned this, but I want to give you an example of what I'm talking about. This is just a small mixer that's perfect for taking a feed in and a feed out to your PC. It's a Behringer X502, and so I guess that means it's got 5 inputs. And one of them in particular is an XLR input, and then there are several 1/4-inch inputs, so there are lots of ways to get sound in. And then there's a 1/4-inch output that can be adapted down to an 1/8 inch to be to go to the line in on your laptop or on your PC. And in this case, this is a situation where you're just really interested on line in. You're not really interested on broadcasting anything else out. You want to take line in, send it to VidBlaster. In VidBlaster, set the audio module to find the Behringer. In this case, if it's line in, if we're just using this directly into the computer, then it'll be that speaker port. So something like this is going to be a useful little tool, and it's, as you can see, it's not very large. It's easy to travel with. It does require AC power. So that's 2 items, your laptop and something like this, that's going to require AC power. And let's see if we can put this someplace where it won't get in the way again. So getting audio in and being able to control that audio is really important. And boy, I should have started with this right off the bat. It's probably not a good idea to try to set your audio during the middle of a sermon or a service. However, it's hard sometimes to get a real-life experience with the audio until you get into those situations. Best bet is going to be to try to get the pastor, or if you're doing the music portion, the worship leader, and have those folks really give you a bona fide trial so that you can get your audio settings right. It's really important to have tested this time and time and time again, to the point of setting it up, doing a test, knocking it all back down, and then setting it up again and doing another test. Sometimes audio will work great, and then you move your USB connection from one camera to a different USB port, and suddenly things go crazy. So it's really important, if you find a way that works, to take a notebook out, write things down so that you can duplicate that exactly every time. And when you run into a problem, then you've got something to look back to and say, okay, have I got everything set up exactly as I know works? And if you don't, then you can switch it. And if you do, then you know what not to check, because you've already got that stuff checked. Welcome to Martin. Glad to have you on the show, Martin. Martin's in the chat room, joining us from Sweden, I think. Is it, Martin? Anyway. So we've got representatives from Sweden and England and Mississippi. And Jim, where are you from? Wisconsin, is it? Illinois? Anyway, folks, oh, and I see Sheldon's in there. Hey, Sheldon. Sheldon's from Kansas City. Anyway, sorry about that. Got a little aside there, got distracted by the chat. So, test, and test. And keep records of what's working. And, you know, you might also keep some notes on the side as to what's not working. sometimes it'll save you testing through something again. Although, I'll tell you, I've been through situations where I've tested the same thing 5 times, and on the 5th time it worked, even though it was the same setup that I tried on the first time. Sometimes there's a little glitch of a difference, especially if it has to do with audio and bringing audio from one mixer to a second mixer, and then from that mixer into a computer which has its own input level at the line in, and then from line in into VidBlaster. So you want to check your settings. The audio portion is probably the most critical. People will tolerate a video feed that's a little fuzzy. They will tolerate one that's a little pixelated. They won't tolerate a whole lot of lip sync problems, but they definitely won't tolerate audio that's, number one, too low to hear, or too high and it's clipping. Number 3, sorry, distracted by the chat again. And number 3, just not good quality. Crackled or muffled, or you know, too much bass. I know in my particular church right now, we're having some issues with the sound system, with the PA, with the audio system, and have brought in an expert to try to help us straighten them out, because I'm certainly not that expert, but I'm learning a lot in the process. And one of the problems was that the worship leader, who is leading his music by his voice, which is how we lead music. We don't lead music by an instrument, because people don't follow instruments, they follow vocals. His voice, let me grab a mic here. His voice was muffled because he was eating the mic. And so it sounded like this. It was just muddy sounding. And so we were trying to adjust that out, and then realized that somebody has configured this whole audio system so that the worship leader, who plays a keyboard, so he's playing piano or whatever instrument he's got the keyboard set up for, the audio from the keyboard and the audio from his mic were mixed together there at his station and then sent to the mixing board as one signal. So in order to adjust the audio for the worship leader, we have to get him to do it. And of course you can't do that in the middle of a service. Anyway, sorry, that was just a side note, but that's the kind of issues that you're liable to bump into, and you may end up having to work with your congregation's audio experts into reconfiguring the house audio to, number 1, improve the house audio, and number 2, make it easier for you to get good audio coming back. I know a lot of pastors like to move away from a podium, and so be kind of free-flowing. So they're wearing a lav mic of some kind, probably, well, definitely wireless. That can raise issues not just for the broadcast, but it can also raise issues for the house feed. I know if they turn their house, if they've got their mic set up on a collar on one side and turn their head one way, or if they're bowing or something like that, they can cause some feedback. So those are issues that you'll want to kind of try to help folks identify, because there's nothing worse if you're watching it at home and you're getting feedback, because that's the only audio you're getting in the service. If you're sitting there in a chair, you're getting the noise all around the room, and so the feedback is probably not as noticeable. Because remember, what we're broadcasting is only what's going through the mic. At least, hopefully, that's the way it's supposed to be. John from Scotland, welcome to the broadcast. Sinclair is a Scottish name. The second most important part of the broadcast, obviously, is going to be the video. And there are lots of ways to do video. I've talked to folks that are doing, as Alan Bunt are doing remote control cameras, so that they can not have to have a cameraman in a very obvious and probably kind of intrusive location. And I'm all for that. I think that's a great way. And if you've got the budget for it, big thumbs up. Sony has got some great ones. You can go back to show number 2 and see the setup that Alan Bunn has got on that. However, most people don't have that budget, at least not starting out. Sometimes you have to go prove the case to the pastor or prove the case to the money people in the church in order to let the purse strings a little loose so that you can buy equipment. And so that may mean that you have to do something that's less than optimal at the very beginning. And I'm always a big one of saying, you know, let's start small and grow larger. The nice thing about starting small is that we learn very intimately every part of what we're doing. If we come in with, you know, 5 cameras and a big video mixer and all sorts of other fancy stuff, we're probably going to make all sorts of mistakes and we're going to have a hard time getting it going. But if you're working with 1 camera to start with and 1 audio source to start with, then the chances of making a mistake are reduced greatly. And frankly, most folks at home are glad for that, especially if it's a situation where they're not getting anything at this point. My suggestion, camera-wise, and I'll go through the cameras that I've used, started out with an old Sony PD-150, I believe that's what it was, which was kind of one of the last Sonys before Sony started doing HDs. So it's a great standard definition camera, has good glass, gives a really good picture, but it's a big camera. I mean, it's I should have brought it out. I mean, it's you know, that long, you know, that wide, and it's not unobtrusive. It definitely, people notice it, and so for folks that are there present live, a big camera like that can be a little intimidating or a little threatening, or certainly can raise questions. And as opposed to having folks entering a worship experience, they're now, you know, worried about, you know, getting on camera. So the second camera we moved to was a smaller Canon Vixia HF 100, which I use for sports, and it has a composite, again, standard definition output for that one, even though it's an HD camera. I do recommend starting out with standard definition, and we'll talk for some reasons about that in just a few minutes. Well, just simply because it's a smaller stream and it's a little easier to get an internet connection to support it in that situation. The camera obtrusiveness issue is one that goes away the smaller the camera gets. So folks say, oh, well, you know, well, let's just get a webcam because they're really, really small. And here's one right here. And goodness, you know, this little rascal can be easily hidden someplace. The problem is it doesn't zoom. I mean, it has a digital zoom, but it doesn't have an optical zoom. And an optical zoom is, of course, is what gives you the good, crisp, clear, picture even as you're zooming in. So for a camera like this, you now have to get the camera closer to the subject. Well, to get the camera closer to the subject, you run into a problem because it's a USB camera, and a USB cable can only be, I think, what is it, 15 feet long. So you say, okay, well, that's great. I'm going to get a USB extension cord. And I've done this. And I got a 10-foot extension cord, but 10 foot wasn't really enough. So I got another 10 foot, plugged it all up, and you know, and what did I get from this camera? I got nothing. The signal, by the time it had gone through, you know, 30 feet of USB cable, was so low that it just wasn't detectable. I've heard, I haven't tested, I've heard that if you use a powered mixer somewhere in that, you can extend that range. I've also heard, haven't tested, that there is a special balun, B-A-L-U-N, that can be used that will convert the USB signal to Cat5. And so that's just your basic internet cable, Ethernet cable, and can go, I think, 100 to 150 feet on Cat5. Well, if that's the case, oh, and the Cat5 also carries enough power through that in order to power the camera. Yeah. The cost of the basic Cat5 USB extender, I think, is about $30, and I'll put a link in the show notes on this so that you can try that. You know, $30 is probably something that you can gamble with. You know, $300, we're not going to gamble with $300 like we would use. Oh, we're getting a note here that Jan is using a 10-meter powered USB cam for the MS LifeCam. Good. Good. And that works fine for him. So 10 meters, that's 30 feet. That'll get you a pretty good distance. I can see having something like this mounted semi-permanently in a location that, again, is unobtrusive, maybe off to the side a little bit, and then maybe slightly digitally zoom in order to get a close enough picture. My favorite solution, which I think can be something that can be permanently mounted, and I haven't done it permanently yet, but is to use an IP camera, to use a security camera, and to have it physically close enough where it doesn't have to zoom in, but then it can be mounted from the ceiling, from a column or a post, from the wall, and pick up the feed from that back to VidBlaster, so that you've got a situation. And in that case, again, you're going to be spending a couple $100 per cam, but there's a possibility of having multiple cams. So if you're streaming an entire worship service, you can have one fixed on the choir or the worship team, one that's fixed on an altar area, one that's fixed at the lectern or where the preaching generally happens, and give some interest to your broadcast by switching cameras. If you are doing like we're doing, where we're only doing the actual sermon itself, then one camera will suffice. The question comes up to me sometimes, well, can I pick up the audio from that camera, whether it's a USB camera or an IP camera, a security camera? And you can, but I don't think you want to, because remember, the audio that camera will pick up will be whatever the audio is in proximity to that camera, and that's going to be people shuffling papers and little kids poking their brothers, and I've got two brothers, so I know about that, and all the other kind of background noise that naturally we just tune out. All of that's going to be picked up and broadcast too. So I would encourage you to stay with the house audio and not try to bring. Now, if we were talking about sports broadcasting, whole different ballgame. Yes, let's bring in some ambient noise. Let's bring in some crowd noise. Let's bring in some players shouting, some coaches shouting, the impact of the ball or the bodies or whatever we want. Yes, that adds to it, but I don't think it adds to a church broadcast at all. I think you want your audio to be as clear and as distinct and as focused in on just the speaker at that point, or the band or the choir or whatever you may have. Let's talk a little bit about the internet connection, because that's really important. Great thing coming down the pike. This is not one, but it's the baby brother. This is a Samsung Galaxy, but the new Galaxy 3 is a hotspot. There are, I think Motorola has got a couple of phones that are hotspots. They even make a separate hotspot device. I know in the States here, Verizon has got a pretty good 4G coverage, but even 3G will get you a half-decent stream. Now some numbers to help you, because folks are always struggling with numbers. You can get a 3G stream that will probably do 300 kbps up pretty reliably. And if that's the case and you're using Flash Media Live Encoder, you can cheat. I mean, obviously the rule is you use half the bandwidth that's available, but I'm a big one on cheating. And you can cheat and use 200 of that for video and 50 of that for audio, and have a 50 kbps buffer. Not a lot of buffer, so it may mean you have some skipping or some pausing or freezing on occasion. If you have a 4G connection, you can just about do high definition depending on how good it is. I've gotten up to 7 megs up speed on my Verizon wireless device consistently. Obviously, I'm not going to use that. I'm going to use 1.5, something like that. I've streamed this show from that device on occasion, and sometimes it's been very successful, and sometimes it's been not very successful because the internet connection, even though I may have gotten a good speed at one point, it was not stable, and so it tended to fluctuate. Of course, if it fluctuates, everything else fluctuates as well. If the church has its own internet, that's great. That's a great way to tap in, but you also want to make sure that if you're tapping in, that that you've got either bandwidth that's allotted just for you, or else maybe nobody else is using it. But if back in the nursery they've got Netflix and they're watching a movie, and somebody else is uploading sermon from last week in a back room, your bandwidth goes away pretty quickly. So you want to get some assurances that if you're using bandwidth that's provided by the church or your place of worship, that on Sunday morning or Saturday night or whenever the worship time is, that bandwidth will be available too. And testing is important, but with bandwidth, you really have to know what it is in that real life situation. It's not just enough to test on a Friday night in hopes that it'll be there on Sunday morning. Been there, done that, guilty of that. And my guess too is as more and more folks get phones with 4G in them, that the 4G network will become a little bit more crowded, and we may not get the good bandwidth that we've been used to in the past on that. So we're talking audio, clean audio into your own mixer so that you can control it. Good video coming in from one or more sources, either permanent or temporary, and as unobtrusive as possible. Good internet connection. Let's talk a little bit about lighting. Lighting, funny story about lighting. My pastor was replacing it. We're a small congregation, so the pastor's sort of a jack of all trades, and he was replacing some lights at the church, and they're the what we call can fixtures, a recessed light fixture, and it had a 100-watt flood lamp in it that was designed for an interior space. And he was replacing them with the exterior floodlights that you would see here, mounted on a garage or in the backyard to illuminate the entire backyard. And of course, it's a bulb that has a lens in it, and the lens has a way of kind of focusing and directing the light. So it ends up being sort of not a terribly narrow beam of light, but not a flood in the sense that it's flooding an area with light. And the one particular place that he put it was right where he decided he was going to preach that day. And so here he is standing there with this light just sort of cascading down on him, which in some ways it was a very dramatic effect. And I'm definitely one for dramatic effects, but in this case it left his face in shadow. And when his face was in shadow, it kind of gave, I thought, a little bit of a sinister appearance to it. Now, he's a very upbeat guy. I don't think he realized it. I don't think anybody was scared or intimidated in any way. But I think when you get a situation like that with lighting, that it definitely, at the very best, it's distracting. And you don't want a situation where people are distracted from the message, because that's why they're there at that particular moment, is for the message. So you want to be very careful with your lighting. We had some work done in our sanctuary several years ago, and the guys that did it, basically we expanded the sanctuary, And so we shifted everything that was installed in one area to the new expanded area, and then knocked out the walls in between so that we had a sanctuary that was twice as large as what it was before. And in doing that, the guys that moved the equipment, including the sound system, but that's a story for another day, also moved a lighting bar that had about a half a dozen halogen spotlights on it. And they moved it directly over the preaching area, and all the lights were pointed down. And of course, it didn't take long for everybody to figure out that that didn't look good, and so that lighting bar just never ever gets used. And it's kind of funny that we ended up a couple years later back in the same situation simply by changing light bulbs. That's a long story to tell, but the point of it is that audio is critical, but video is important too. And the video doesn't look good if the lighting's not good. I know in conversations with Martin Kay with Zen Computer Services in England, that there are specific ways to light interviews. You want a key light, and you want a fill light, and you want a backlight, kind of a three-way lighting system. In a church situation, you probably don't have the leeway to start setting up lights right there. You have to kind of, for the most part, kind of go with what you've got. But remember that a well-lit subject is going to be a subject that's going to be easier to see, and it's going to be easier for the camera to capture a good, clear image if the image is well lit. So it may be that you have to work with the folks there in your church to increase the wattage of bulbs, or if they're on dimmers, to increase the dimmers a little bit, not to detract from what else is going on if possible, but to help with a good video presentation. Now, this is one kind of testing that can be done after hours and not have to be done in a pseudo live situation. This can be done anytime when you've got lights. Now, again, if it's a church with a lot of natural light, that's something that you're not going to be able to test at night. So you want to keep that in mind too. And it may be that you end up causing a situation where folks want to reassess and reevaluate what their current situation is. In fact, that's just happened in my church, as we're talking about streaming again, and trying to fix some of the audio issues that we've got. So we're basically reassessing the entire audio situation. Again, not a big church, not fancy equipment. The fellows that set it up years ago pulled out some old stereo speakers from a stereo he had in his house and mounted them on the ceiling, and mounted them to a mixing board, or connected them to a mixing board through another device that somebody had used in a band somewhere that turns out to be a powered mixer. And it's just it's an amalgamation of different devices that weren't necessarily intended for this purpose, but it was great because it was more than what we had at that time, and in some cases, any audio is better than no audio. So there's a lot to be said for that. Let's see, trying to collect my thoughts here. Again, and I apologize that this show is not as well planned as it could have, would have, should have been. We've talked about camera placement, camera type, we talked about audio, we talked about lighting. Let's talk a little bit about how folks are going to watch this. Should you use a free service? Should you use a paid service? A lot of people have a fear. I was talking to somebody the other day. I take a lot of troubleshooting calls on VidBlaster, some from my own clients and some from folks that have bought VidBlaster elsewhere. And this one person was asking, or complaining actually, about one of the free services, because the ads that were being shown as a pre-roll on the free service were not at all appropriate for what they were doing in their church service. And right in the middle of the service, all of a sudden, bang, would come a mid-roll ad for 30 seconds, and it would interrupt whatever their service was, and they would, they would essentially, whoever was watching would miss out on that. I am a big fan of the free services. That's where I started. I cut my teeth on Ustream, and I've used Justin TV and Livestream and Bamboozer and some of the other lesser-known ones. And they're great, and they have their place. But I think in worship is a little different. As the commercial world begins to intrude with pop-up ads that are going to cover the lower third, and with pre-roll and mid-roll ads, that maybe that's the time to consider moving to a paid service. A paid service doesn't have to be expensive, and my guess would be, at least at first, you're not going to receive thousands of viewers. Now, maybe you're going to be the exception to the rule, but my guess is most folks are going to start out with dozens or maybe less than dozens. And any growth that you see will probably be incremental as opposed to instantaneous. What that means is that you can budget a little better and take a service like, I don't mind plugging these guys by name because I use them, Dacast, D-A-C-A-S-T, Dacast.com. I'm on a service where I buy, 100 gigabytes a month, maybe, something like that, for $29. And that 100 gigs includes anything I stream to them, and then the total of all the streams from them to all the viewers. So each one of you watching live right now is one of the viewers, and I'm paying for that bandwidth as well as for the bandwidth between me and San Francisco. Or actually, excuse me, the Dacast server I'm using is in Washington, D.C. And I'm paying for that bandwidth at the rate of $29 a month. And I'll have anywhere from 20 to 60 viewers at any one time. If I were to suddenly get 120 viewers, I'm not using my 100 gigs a month anyway, so I probably have a lot of room. And one of the nice things about Dacast is whatever I don't use goes in the bank. It just rolls over, kind of like the old cell phone minutes for that one company. It rolls over into a bank, and so it kind of becomes a buffer between me and an overage situation. So I highly encourage the use of a paid service for that. And you can take it and embed the player on the church website. That the embed codes are all there. There are lots of things you can do with it on that. One of the questions has come up in the chat room to output to a projector or a big screen. And that's a definite possibility. That is a definite possibility. And I haven't done it personally, but I know I've talked to several folks, that have, and they've done it very successfully. You have to be really careful that you don't allow latency to take over in that video stream, because that becomes a situation that we talked about earlier where you've got a lip sync problem, and now all of a sudden you've got a Chinese movie where the mouth and the audio don't match up. And so you have to be really careful not to use substandard cabling, and it really has to be something that you test carefully. But I know it works. I'm working with somebody now that does the big screens in the football stadiums, and they're using VidBlaster to supply audio and video to those screens. And so, obviously something like that in a large venue, lip sync is really, really important. And I think, see if that's a good idea. We'll try to see if we can't put a show together on that and bring in a guest to talk just about that, and some bona fide ways to get over the latency issue. One of the other things that I've heard folks in churches do is that they'll take the live stream and feed it internally throughout the church so that folks in the nursery can watch, so that folks, if there's overflow seating, so that they can watch, something that would just be done on the local area network, so as not to eat up the bandwidth of the church, but hopefully different network than what you're using for the live internet feed. That is a definite possibility on that one. One of the things that makes VidBlaster a good tool for this is, number one, its flexibility with the ability to take so many different kind of cameras, USB cameras, composite cameras. If you can get a camera feed into VidBlaster, most of the time VidBlaster can see it. Now there's sometimes where there's some issues with particular capture cards that don't have a direct show driver or don't have a good direct show driver. There's some IP cameras that for some reason, those security cameras, that just won't work. Excuse me. And so you'll have to do some testing on that. But for the most part, VidBlaster is very forgiving with bringing a camera feed in. Audio, generally pretty simple. VidBlaster's not big on audio. It's really counting on that mixer to take the audio mix and send it through to the streaming software, whether it's Flash Media Live Encoder or Windows Media Encoder, whatever you're choosing to use, either knowingly or behind the scenes with VidBlaster. The other part of the process that VidBlaster is really good with, one of its features that I think was designed and installed mostly for churches, was the PowerPoint module. And the PowerPoint module allows you to take whatever PowerPoints have been previously designed, and instead of taking a picture of what's up on a screen that's being projected on the wall, you can either, well, there are two ways to do this. The first way is to have the same PowerPoint and to follow along click by click on that PowerPoint. There are ways to actually steal that feed from the computer that's generating that PowerPoint and bring it into VidBlaster, but again, that's something for another show. That's beyond this show on church broadcasting today. So the PowerPoint module is a great way to import. Let's see if I've got some way to show you what that might look like. Well, I thought I did. I think this is just that's just a text overlay. So that's not a good one. That's from Alan Bunt's church, where in the service he would put the words to the music up there. And let's see. Yep. And that's a good shot of what the church would look like there. So cameras, audio, lighting, PowerPoint, output to other devices, internet speeds, internet devices. Folks in the chat room, have I left things out? Somebody, there's a note in the chat room that they're complaining about the shine off a bald head, and that can definitely be distracting. It would be good to place the lighting in such a way that you didn't get that reflection. In fact, that's the same kind of issue that I face here in the studio when trying to get a camera shot that's going to get my glasses, but is not going to get the reflection of the lights in the room. And as you can tell, when I turn to the side, you can see where the lights are, because all of a sudden the lens of the glass will pick them up. I've tried to stay away from lighting that's directly in front of me for that reason. And if you've got a bald head, then obviously the lighting that I've got going right here that's coming in from behind me might make a glare that would be pretty distracting. Let's see, what else have we got here? We're about out of time. Love to have some questions from the chat. Appreciate all the folks that have tuned in today in the chat room. That's what I'm looking at over here in the side. And let's see. There was some conversation when we were talking about cameras of the GoPro, which is a really neat little camera. I don't have one, but I'm intrigued by it and probably will end up buying one. It's a fixed lens, from what I understand. It has no ability to zoom. But it has a tremendous ability to capture at 1080p amazing image. I'm not a camera guy, but however they've got it organized, it's like the old little Canon Instamatics, where it doesn't matter how close or how far your subject was, they were always in focus. I guess it's depth of field. Has a very long depth of field as opposed to a narrow depth of field where I would be in focus, but the background behind me would be out of focus, which is one of the appealing things about a single lens reflex camera, is the ability to have that great depth of field. The GoPro doesn't have the depth of field, which means that anything in the picture is in focus, and that's really nice. And that you may be able to take a 1080 feed and take it in a picture-in-picture and just take a section of that and blow it up, and it would still have enough clarity to be able to do that. You might be able to do that. In fact, if you do that, let me know. That would really be interesting. But I'd rather do it with a $90 webcam than I would a $200 cam. But you never know. Let's see if we've got some other notes here in the chat. What is the maximum resolution you can send to cast? Well, you know, that's a good question, Sheldon. That's from Sheldon Neal with Slice Networks. And Sheldon was one of our guests a while back when we were talking about sports broadcasting. And let me take a second and just look it up, because I can look it up pretty quickly on my feed. And looks like 1920 by 1080 or 1280 by 720. So you've got your high definition sizes there. Decast likes to use Flash Media Live Encoder. It will also use Windows Media Encoder if you'd rather do that. But it's pretty well set up to use Flash easily. And of course, in Flash you can choose whether you want to use the VP6 encoder or the H.264 encoder. At this point, I think one of the limitations with Decast is that it's not very iPhone friendly. But I understand they're working on that and are supposed to have that available soon. Not sure when soon is, but soon. And that's a big deal. If you've got a situation where folks want to be able to watch you here instead of here, they can't do it with Decast at this point unless you've made some special arrangements with Decast. I think that brings us to the end of this topic. A little plug, if you're interested in VidBlaster, I am a VidBlaster reseller and would be happy to sell it to you and help you learn how to use it and support you in the event of trouble, which sooner or later everybody runs into trouble. You'll get my email address and my cell phone number. If you buy VidBlaster from vidblaster.com, you get great support too, but it's through a forum, and I'm one of the moderators on the forum, and we'll be happy to help you there too, but I'd rather have you buy it from me if you would. Excited about next week's show, and I hope you will. I can't tell you who it is quite yet, but I would like you to follow us on Twitter, VidBlaster Guy. It's the @ VidBlaster Guy. And you can stay abreast of all our announcements about the show and know who our guests are. Plus, we'll probably be announcing this on the front page of the website. So if you're watching us on YouTube, the website is thatvidblasterguy.com, and you can catch there. All of our shows are available on YouTube, and you can get to those going to YouTube and just YouTube search for That VidBlaster Guy, or go to our website and go to the archives, and there are direct links to all the shows there. So I think we're going to call it a day for the show. Appreciate you tuning in. I appreciate all the help of folks in the pre-show getting the audio dialed in. And we've got a little post-roll here that I'm pretty excited for the post-roll credits. Let's see if we can get this to run and see if it'll work. Anyway, I'm Tom Sinclair, That VidBlaster Guy. It's been a treat to be with you this week. Come back and see us next Tuesday or catch us in the archives. If you have any questions, shoot me an email, tom@thatvidblasterguy.com.